Welcome to all of our new joinees, and a very warm welcome back to anybody that's attended any previous webinars with us. Today's webinar will explore the pre-IND meeting, what it is, why have one, and how to prepare for one. This webinar is geared towards early stage innovators and will explain the benefit of incorporating FDA feedback from an effective pre-IND meeting into your project to ultimately save you time and money. With that, I'm thrilled to introduce our presenter, Dr. Carmella Moody, who I have the pleasure of working with directly in support of the Catalyze program on the side of the Catalyze Coordinating Center, where Carmella serves as a technical project lead. Carmella is an expert with over 30 years of experience in regulatory affairs, project management, and quality assurance. Carmella brings her experience in these areas to training teams for regulatory agency meetings, as well as leading activities for submission to regulatory bodies. And so I will go ahead and turn it over to Carmella.
Hi, good morning, or it's actually, depending on where you are in the world, it may be still morning or it is noontime. But anyway, thank you so much for joining the presentation today. I really want this to be helpful, and so please don't hesitate at the end of the presentation to ask questions, because I think it's hard to get everything together that you need, and so I do want it to be as helpful as can be. So next slide. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today in this presentation is just a general overview for the pre-IND meeting, then some specific information or suggestions for the meeting request letter and the briefing document that needs to be submitted to support the pre-IND meeting, then a short slide to tell you about how Catalyze program can help you with your pre-IND meeting, and then hopefully we'll get some questions and we can answer some of your burning questions. So next slide. Legal advice. This is my information that I've learned, and it's specifically does not constitute legal or regulatory advice. Next slide. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about just the pre-IND meeting overview. And one of the things that's important to know is that the pre-IND meeting format and is the same whether it's your product is in the Center for Drugs or the Center for Biologics. So this is equally relevant for both divisions. Next slide. Okay, so what is a pre-IND meeting? And basically it is a formal meeting, and what formal means is that it was set up from the Prescription Drug User Fee Act that says that the FDA will meet with sponsors. There are 3 different types of meetings, but the pre-IND meeting is the type B meeting. And what that means is that from the date that the meeting request is received by the agency, they will schedule a meeting within 60 calendar days of that meeting request, when at all possible. And they are really good about maintaining and getting you in and getting your meeting in within that 60-day period. Another important point to note about pre-IND meetings is that usually there's one pre-IND meeting allowed per application or per IND. So it's important that you think about when is the best time to actually have the meeting. And then another important point is that there's no charge for any of the formal meetings by the FDA. Next slide. Okay, so why does FDA say that you should have a pre-IND meeting? And really it's to get their feedback to address development challenges so that you can focus and streamline your development program. Next slide. Okay, what a pre-IND meeting is not. The pre-IND meeting is not the place that you prove to the FDA how well the development is going. You do need to provide enough information to let the FDA understand that you have a good control of your development program. But really, the pre-IND meeting is an opportunity to present significant challenges that the sponsors encountered from a quality, non-clinical, clinical, or regulatory perspective, and to gain agency feedback on the sponsor's plan to address those challenges. The IND is actually where you'll provide the information to prove to the FDA that you've implemented enough controls to go into human clinical trials. Next slide. Okay, so when does FDA suggest that a pre-IND meeting is beneficial? And basically, it's when you have a product that's for a serious or a life-threatening disease, it's a new molecular entity, you're new to drug development, there's no specific guidance documents available relative to the drug or biologic that you're developing. So basically, it's pretty much any time you have a big question. Next slide. So the FDA says that the benefit of a pre-IND meeting, it's to help you avoid unnecessary studies so that you can figure out what's must-have and what's nice to have, to make sure that the studies you design are appropriate from their perspective, to get the overall feedback on your proposed regulatory and clinical or non-clinical strategy. It helps to minimize the chances for a clinical hold when you submit your IND. And it's been shown that having a pre-IND meeting can help minimize cost because you're working with the FDA to clearly define endpoints and goals of your development program. And plus it gives you an opportunity to meet with some of with your team at the FDA that will be reviewing your application. Next slide. So a lot of times I get questions about, will the FDA tell us what to do? And the answer to that is a big no. The FDA won't specifically tell you what to do, but they will provide you very thoughtful feedback on clinical trial design, tox issues, anything that has to do with immunogenicity or any of the problems you may be running into, basically when you pose your question the best way that you can, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. Next slide. So is the FDA feedback binding? What the FDA tells you is that you can choose to accept the FDA feedback, or you can use an alternative strategy. But the main thing to keep in mind is that when FDA gives you guidance on a particular item, they are using their extended knowledge of other products and programs that are ongoing that have very similar indications or are similar. So what you're going to get is a broad spectrum view of what the agency may be holding all of the sponsors with similar drugs to. The FDA can decide when you submit the IND that based on the additional data that's been provided, that the information they provided wasn't really relevant. And so they can specifically tell you that a response to a meeting comment is no longer valid. They try very hard not to do that, but that's another reason why when you're developing your briefing document, you really need to be very clear about the questions that you want to ask. Next slide. So we're going to talk now about an overview of a pre-IND meeting. And again, it's the same for CDER and CBER. Okay, so what you do is when you get ready to, when you want to have a pre-IND meeting, you submit a meeting request to the division where you, that's relevant for your specific product. You ask, there are 3 different choices. You can have a face-to-face, a teleconference, video conference, or get written responses. In the world of COVID, I'm not even sure that they're holding any face-to-face meetings right now. So what you're most likely going to get, at least here for the short term, is a teleconference or a written response. But you get to choose which one that you want. And when you submit the meeting request, the key thing to know is that you provide a draft list of questions in that meeting request. And that draft list of questions helps the FDA to know who to bring to the meeting to be able to address your specific questions. So within 21 days of the meeting request, the FDA will respond back to you to indicate what meeting format you've been granted. And then they'll schedule that meeting within 60 days of the initial request. In your meeting request document also, you include in there some suggested times, some suggested days, whether morning or afternoon is better. And they work very hard to try to meet some of your specific requirements that you've included. But you have to remember they have many, many meetings, and so they're doing the best that they can. So 30 days prior to the meeting, the sponsor needs to submit a briefing document with the finalized questions that you want the agency to respond to. And it provides the information, enough of the scientific information to allow FDA to respond to your questions. Next slide. So what happens after you submit your briefing document? Then 24 to 72 hours before the meeting, and oftentimes it's 24 hours before the meeting, the FDA will provide preliminary responses to the sponsor's questions. And the sponsor should then review those preliminary responses, and if they agree, the sponsor thinks that all of the questions have been answered thoroughly and there are no further outstanding questions or concerns, then the sponsor can choose to cancel the meeting. If the sponsor decides that there's something else that they need a little bit of discussion on, then what needs to happen is the sponsor notifies the regulatory project manager and specifically tells the agency, okay, which questions need further discussion. So, you know, if you submit 12 questions, maybe you're going to have 3 questions that you want some further feedback on. And then what will happen is the meeting will focus only on those questions. And this is done really because you only have an hour to discuss. So you want to make sure that you're getting your specific, the most burning questions answered in that hour time frame. Next slide. So the conduct of the meeting is, like I said, 1 hour scheduled for the meeting. The regulatory project manager at the FDA for your project chairs the meeting. Generally, there's no presentation that's provided to the FDA anymore about the company or anything like that. That used to be the standard, but it really isn't any longer. Because again, FDA wants to maximize the time for questions. So the first 5 minutes or so are for introductions of the FDA and the sponsor attendees. They will send you a list of their FDA attendees, and they really want the exact list of the sponsor attendees. So if the sponsor attendees change between the time you submit your meeting request and the time that you're actually going to have the meeting, you need to let the regulatory project manager know who the sponsor attendees are. And then for the next 50 minutes or so, you will specifically go through the questions in the order that you've requested. So you list the primary concern questions first, and you tell the regulatory project manager, we want to talk about this first, and then we want to talk about these others if there's time. And then generally the last 5 minutes are for, you have to request this, but it's a good idea for the sponsor to specifically state or restate what their understanding is of the agreements and the discussion that was had with the FDA. And then what's going to happen, next slide. Yeah, so then what the FDA is then going to do is they're going to update the meeting responses that they initially provided with the information that was included or was discussed in the meeting. And generally, there's a 30-day window for them to get those final meeting responses to you. Oftentimes, the sponsor will send their notes to the FDA a few days after the meeting, just to make sure that what the sponsor thinks the slant or the thought process for the meeting or what was discussed, make sure that that specific information is provided to the agency. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to go a little bit more now into the pre-IND meeting request. Next slide. Okay, there is a specific guidance document, and I have the information and the links and would be glad to provide it to you, but there is a specific guidance document that tells you the specific information that should be included in the pre-IND meeting request. It's listed here. You have an objective, the agenda, again, the list of the specific questions that you want to ask, and you need to group your questions by discipline. Again, like I was saying, the sponsor participants, and actually, who you would like to be there from the FDA perspective. You don't have to specifically have names of people, but you can say pharmacologist or CMC representative. Generally, the FDA, by looking at your questions, will decide who they need, but you can include that information in there. You have to provide a little bit of information about the drug or the biologic that you're going to be talking about. It's important you include a proposed indication, meaning a clinical indication. Give some feedback on your dosing regimen. Again, the meeting date, and again, if you have any preferences or for morning or afternoon or Mondays versus Fridays, then you can put all that information in there and FDA will do the best that they can. And then 30 days before the actual meeting is when you actually submit the briefing document or the background package with the data that you need FDA to review to be able to answer the questions. Next slide. Okay, I love this quote. It's if I had an hour to solve a problem, my life depended on the solution, I'd spend the first 55 minutes determining the proper question to ask. For once I know the proper question, I could solve the problem in less than 5 minutes. And that's attributed to Albert Einstein. And that's very true from an FDA in a pre-IND and getting the most out of your pre-IND meeting. You want to know specifically the questions that you need to ask. You want them to be directed. You don't want them to be open-ended. And you have to realize that, 12 to 15 questions is about the limit of the number of questions that you should be able to ask. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the briefing document. Next slide. So the briefing document is really what's very important. And again, it needs to be submitted at least 30 days before the meeting date. If you do not submit the briefing document at least 30 days before the meeting date, the FDA will cancel the meeting and you'll have to reschedule. But there's no specific mandate for the information that needs to be included in the briefing document. The information that goes in there really needs to be relative to the questions that you are going to ask or that you really need feedback on. You do need to include some information to demonstrate to the FDA that you understand your product. So I don't want to say that you don't include any background information, because you do. And then you have to make sure you put in your finalized questions. And then again, you want to be very judicious about the information that you include. You want your data to be summarized and succinct. You want to use flow charts. You want to use any sort of mechanism that you can to help the information that the FDA is reviewing to flow. A key point to remember too is that after you submit the briefing document, if there's some other information that you decided before your meeting that you would have liked to have included in the briefing document, they will not let you include, in most situations, they will not let you talk about an issue that hasn't already been presented in the briefing document. Next slide. So some of the information that's good to include, I know from the Catalyze perspective, we're going to start talking a lot about the target product profile. And basically, the FDA says the target product profile, it really is a way for you to give the agency an idea of where you want to go, okay? As the program, when you get to the marketing application, where you want to go. So it's important, again, for the product description, the mechanism of action, some clinical pharmacology, your indication. Again, it's very important. You have to have an indication. And information about endpoints, primary, secondary, those sorts of things. And you can have an optimistic, a target, or a minimal. But again, you don't have to have a target product profile for the pre-IND briefing document, but it often helps to direct FDA's understanding in a very succinct manner where you want to go with your product. Next slide. So for example, from a clinical perspective, there's one thing I want to say I forgot about the briefing document. The briefing document we have found, or I've found over many, many years of working on pre-IND briefing documents, is that it really is very important and it works better if you have a really, really good draft of your pre-IND briefing document when you submit your draft questions and your meeting request letter, because it is so helpful to actually think about the data. And it's usually one of the first opportunities, for you to really get your whole team together and think about all of the information that you need to submit and identify what your questions really are. So the process of getting that document, drafting that document, most often helps you to really understand and focus in on the questions that you need to ask. From a clinical perspective, what we recommend, and usually, the clinical issues run the pre-IND meeting are the most important to discuss, but we suggest that for the first study, you provide a draft protocol. You don't have to provide a draft protocol. You can provide just a synopsis of the clinical study, but you need to let them know, again, the route of administration, the indication, endpoints, inclusion, exclusion, blinding, stopping rules are really important to include. And we've found that when we submit a draft protocol, that even when if there are sections or components of the clinical protocol that we didn't really even ask a question about, the FDA clinical reviewer may comment and provide feedback on something that we didn't even have a question about. So usually we really strongly suggest a draft protocol. And then for the follow-on study, you would include, again, the synopsis for the first follow-on IND study. Next slide. So non-clinical information that you include, usually, again, too, in your briefing document, you're going to have a clinical section, a non-clinical section, and a CMC or a quality section. Okay. So the non-clinical information that's generally included, and what we usually recommend is that you have at least a dose range finding study, 1 to 2 species, so that you can have an idea of how to design your GLP studies. And so that dose range finding study it's not GLP study, but it helps you to understand where you need to go. And you have basic safety pharmacology information. And if you've gotten information on genetic tox, then that's good information to summarize. But the overall goal, usually from the non-clinical perspective, is that you want to present the outline of your pivotal toxicology studies. So the FDA will use, with the clinical protocol, that they will look at the clinical protocol and help make sure that your pivotal toxicology studies are developed and appropriate to support what you want to do clinically. Next slide. So again, there's some slides that, again, may have to do with some information that you want to include. It's a good idea, again, to have tables where you summarize information. It's quick, it's easy for them to review. So you may have, you have distribution, metabolism, pharmacokinetics. Next slide. And then safety, your safety and your toxicology information. Again, think of ways to include the information you want the agency to know about, but make it in a very friendly, usable manner. Next slide. The other section that we usually include is the quality or the CMC section. And again, the amount of information for each one of these sections is going to be based on which, what your questions specifically are. But from a quality CMC perspective, if you don't have any perceived manufacturing issues or anything, then usually what you would include is at least a flow chart for the manufacturing process for the drug substance and the drug product, a little bit of information in narrative format to go with that, a list of your tests and specifications that you plan to apply for your drug substance and your drug product. You can include specifications, but the FDA is going to tell you that the review of specifications is an IND issue. So really what you want to do is you want to include the list of testing that you plan to perform on your batch. And then the FDA will tell you if there's a specific test that you don't have on your list that they think you need to perform. And then for biologics, if there's going to be any change between what was used in any toxicology studies and what's going to be done clinically, then you can include your comparability protocol plans so that FDA will understand how you plan to bridge the information from the tox over to the human studies. Next slide. Okay, so how can the Catalyze program help? We try really, really hard to help you develop our overall regulatory strategy. And that regulatory strategy includes helping with those three primary disciplines: clinical, non-clinical, and CMC, and also help you decide on maybe the best regulatory path to use, or also when it's best to submit your pre-IND and have your pre-IND meeting relative to your overall program. And we have full sets of templates for pre-IND briefing documents, target product protocol, the clinical synopsis, the clinical protocols, all of the sections of the quality or the CMC section. And we can provide you those, and we can provide review and provide guidance on the content of the information that goes into the information for your pre-IND briefing document. One of the things that I often get asked is, how long should you plan to get ready for a pre-IND meeting? And of course, it's going to be different for each program, but usually it's in the 3-month time frame from the time that you start to really think about what's going into your briefing document till the time that you have your draft briefing document and you're ready to submit it. So, and you're not working on that pre-IND briefing document every day, but at least it gives you some time frame to think about for how long to comfortably be able to put together the information for your pre-IND meeting. And next slide. So these are helpful links. As I indicated, there is a specific FDA guidance document for formal meetings between the FDA and sponsors. Strongly recommend that you look at that document. Again, it contains the information about the specific format and content of the meeting request letter. And then there's some really good small business industry assistance webinars that help you to understand again about the pre-IND meeting. And there are specific Code of Federal Regulations in Part 21 CFR Part 312 that covers meetings. But all of this information is really helpful, and we can help translate some of this information from these guidance documents and into your programs. And so I have my name here and my email address. Please, if you have any issues or you have some questions that you didn't get answered, let me know. I'm happy. I'm really happy to help out any way that I can. So I think that's the end of the presentation. Next slide. Now we're on to questions and answers.
Okay, your first question, will approach to pre-IDE be similar to pre-IND?
Good question. I would say yes. There are different requirements for the pre-IDE versus the IND, but we do have team members within the Catalyze program that can help you specifically with pre-IDE.
Thank you. What is the difference between clinical synopsis and clinical protocol?
The synopsis is just the front matter for the clinical protocol, where it's a couple of pages in the beginning of the protocol that specifically gives the FDA the information about what you plan to do. But when I say a draft clinical protocol, I mean a draft clinical protocol with all of the sections and all of the information in there, excuse me, with all of the inclusion, exclusion criteria, information about, safety reporting, what you're going to do. And, is for phase 1 is around 30 to 50 pages. Oh, and that's another thing. From the pre-IND briefing document perspective, usually you can get up to 100 pages. But remember, the FDA only has 30 days and they're not totally dedicated to your project only. So that's why, be judicious about how much information you include and try not to make the documents, so long. But usually, 60, 70 pages may be what you would include for a briefing document. Again, if you don't have that many questions, it can be considerably smaller. But if you address or you have questions for each one of the 3 disciplines, then that's, a ballpark range.
Can the FDA access the proprietary preclinical data submitted previously by different sponsors?
That's interesting. You can have a cross-reference letter from another IND or an NDA, but there's no mechanism for FDA to review toxicology or safety information for a product without that cross-reference. Did that answer that question?
I believe so. I'll wait for follow-up, but we'll go to the next question, if that's okay. Do small companies often bring regulatory consultant along to the meeting with the FDA?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. We think, and the way we work is we, as regulatory team members, we become a portion of your team. And it's really important to have the regulatory perspective on your team when you do go to your meetings.
For innovators outside of the Catalyze program, are there people to contact for help with the pre-IDE preparation?
You can use my information, cmoody@rti.org, and we can get you oriented to someone that can help you, and under a separate contract or something.
And do we need permission from other sponsors to cross-reference?
Yes. For an IND, you do need a letter of cross-reference. Or if you're going to include information in a pre-IND, yes.
Has the FDA made a decision on how they will treat imaging agents as drugs or as devices moving forward?
And the answer to that is, I don't know. There's a lot of things that you need to think about relative to whether an imaging agent is a drug or a device. Okay. But the slant is, even though there was the lawsuit that indicated about the imaging agents being a device, there's still a lot of ways that the FDA thinks it needs to be a drug. But again, I'm not an expert on that. But we can, if you want to have some more specific discussions, let us know, because I think it's really important that we understand exactly everything that has to do with your imaging agent before we can help you decide whether it's going to be a drug or a device. In my experience, imaging agents have been always drugs, and we've not been able to get around that. But again, just let us know, and we'll have some further discussions.
Can I ask FDA any questions before pre-IND meeting?
Yes, sure. On the FDA webpage, for every division, there are listed supervisory project managers. And so you can contact the supervisory project manager and tell them that, you're working on a program, you want to submit a pre-IND briefing document at certain points in time, and you have a question that you'd like to ask. That doesn't get you very far, okay? Because the FDA is not going to give you an answer without the data to support the answer, okay? So you can ask questions, and usually if you ask like a regulatory question or a question like that, they will answer, but they will not answer a question about a technical issue unless they have the supporting information to be able to answer that question appropriately.
Is a face-to-face meeting advantageous over just written responses?
When face-to-face meetings are possible, yes, especially if you have, especially if you have a particularly difficult issue that you would like to have addressed. And you can have conversations back and forth. You can do the same thing with a teleconference or a video conference. But the main thing is, if you get written responses, you don't have the opportunity to have that back and forth.
We have therapeutic antibody in human vector, but not in pooled cell lines at this point. Do we need the final stage, or excuse me, final single GMP line antibody in order to apply for pre-IND meeting?
No, you do not have to have, for pre-IND meeting, there's no requirement that you have any, provide any information that's GLP or GMP or anything like that. You need to give FDA a good understanding of how you're going to go from early phase to later phase, in your briefing document to help bridge, okay? But there are no specific requirements of any of the data or the information that you're submitting coming from a GLP or a GMP study or anything like that, no.
What is the prior sponsor's data? Excuse me, what if the prior sponsor's data is publicly available? Can we just refer to those specific NDA?
It depends on how those data are available, okay? That would be a question that if you could send me that question maybe by email and give me a little bit more information, I want to make sure that I'm giving you the right answer, and I think I need to ask a few more questions.
Where do sponsors usually fail in the pre-IND meeting? Examples of what crucial questions sponsors typically forget to ask that later end up causing problems with the IND?
Usually it's the way, what you want to do, again, is to go back to my Albert Einstein quote. You want to make sure that you're asking the right questions so the FDA can respond to your question. Again, if you make it an open-ended question, then the FDA might say, well, this is a review issue, or they may refer you specifically to a guidance document. So you really want your question to be very specific, very focused, and not open-ended, so that you can get the answers that you need and to really help you develop your program. So I think that's what I see as the biggest issue is, what your questions are, how you're asking your questions.
You only provide the synopsis on the follow-on clinical study, not in detail then?
You can provide more information, but again, usually remember, again, the FDA only has 30 days, and they're really going to focus on that first study, that first introductory, IND enabling clinical study. So that's why usually they won't, it doesn't help really to provide a full fleshed out second protocol. Again, unless maybe it's an adaptive trial or something. If you have an adaptive trial and it's, goes from early phase to a later phase, or, you have single dose going into multiple dose, then yeah, you wouldn't want to include that information. But again, it usually is the focus of that first clinical study.
If my drug has 2 different potential clinical trial indications, can I have 2 pre-IND meetings with different sections of FDA?
Okay. I think that to tell you that is division specific. Okay. Usually, all right, you can, if you have, especially if your drug is formulated differently for one program versus another program, then you for sure should be able to ask for 2 separate pre-IND meetings. Okay, if the drug is exactly the same drug, it's exactly the same formulation, then they may hold you to a single pre-IND meeting. But most of the time they'll work with you the best that they can to be able to help you answer your questions. You can also have, you don't have to just have a type B meeting, which is scheduled in 60 days. You can also have a type C meeting, which is the only difference between B and C is that C is scheduled in, I think it's 90 days. So there are more than one mechanism for getting feedback. And again, that's why you want to work with a regulatory team that can help you strategize about the best way to go.
And do you recommend, or is it necessary to work with a consultant to prepare pre-IND meetings?
No. I think that there are really good guidance documents out there. I'm biased because I think it's helpful to have regulatory support because we think about things a little differently, or might help be able to present the questions in a better manner or things based on our experience, but no, you don't have to.
All right, we have about 6 more minutes for questions and we have 2 hand raised. So Safia, would you like to ask your question? You should have the ability to unmute now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I want to ask how do we ensure that we get face-to-face meeting? Because my experience is that you ask for it and they go for the written response.
Yeah, that is totally at the FDA's what they think is appropriate. If they think that you need to have, or all of the issues can be addressed in a teleconference or written responses only, then that's what you're going to get. You can ask, and even if they come back to you when they call you up and say, we've decided it could be written responses only or a teleconference, you can try and negotiate and see what they'll do, but it's totally the FDA's purview about which type of meeting, or whether it's face-to-face or written. So I'm sorry, I can't help you much there.
Okay, Roger. You should have the ability to unmute now. Roger, are you there? All right, let's try Robert Swift. Robert, are you able to ask your question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can.
Okay, so if you're approaching the FDA at a pre-IND meeting for a drug that is already approved, so it's effectively, the plan is a 505(b)(2), the drug is approved in the same patient population in terms of age that you want to go to, but you're using it in a different indication. How much preclinical data do you actually need to get the FDA to sign off on that? Or do you need any preclinical data? Because it's actually basically off-label use in the same age group, but for a different application, different use.
Yeah, what you do is provide the FDA with the label for the approved indication, okay? And you specifically point out the difference for your product, but you have to know if for example, your dose is higher than the dose that's approved, then you're going to have to do more work.
Yeah, same dose, same schedule.
Same dose, same schedule?
Right.
And so the question is,
do they require preclinical data in, let's say, a mouse model to show that the drug is effective at all in that disease? Because you're going into a different disease. Or is it deficient?
yeah,
That-
usually when possible, before you go into your pre-IND meeting, you have data in an animal model to support your drug in the indication, usually.
Okay, but not required. It's just a question of how much pushback the FDA gives in a, a reason to believe, right, that this would work, but you don't actually have animal data at this point to point to that. And frankly, the clinical trial is less expensive than generating the animal data.
Right. Usually you have to have something to convince them that the drug is relevant to the potential human clinical indication. And so it may not necessarily be an animal study. Maybe it's some combination of animal in vitro. But again, that might be a situation where you would want to have your pre-IND meeting a little early, since you really need to talk with them about what are the data that they're going to expect to support the new indication.
It's certainly literature data could be applicable here, correct?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Okay, that appears to be all questions.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Carmella. Now I will prompt Cameron to go ahead and launch our evaluation poll for all of our wonderful attendees. It's only about 5 questions, so it should not take you very long at all. But while you are doing that, I will go ahead and share a few reminders for you. First, our June webinar is scheduled for Thursday, June 16th, and will be presented by the Catalyze Scientific Director, Dr. Mike Peck, as well as 2 members of Innovation Advisors who support Catalyze from the side of the Coordinating Center. Together, the presenters will walk through applying to the Catalyze program ahead of our next receipt date, which is on July 21st for Catalyze applications. As well as highlighting what makes the program unique. And they'll also give potential applicants a look into the broad array of resources available through the program. The registration is available on our website at nhlbicatalyze.org/events. And as always, you can also visit our website to stay up to date with us and sign up for our email list. So with that, I think that is the conclusion of today's webinar. And once again, a giant thank you to Carmella.
Thank you, everyone. I will leave the poll up for just a moment to allow others to respond, but you're welcome to go ahead and log off for the day. Thank you all.